Echo. Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for your good comments and questions. And you see, I prepared a little cheat sheet, but I have to be very quick and selective in order to kind of get through everything. I probably have many comments which I won't say anything about, which I can't, unfortunately. But anyway, so that's a follow-up lecture to what I told you in the morning, and some of the things which I should explain a bit better, I guess. Well, anyway, so we had this first slide, and I won't repeat much here because I think the point is quite clear. You have this first-person perspective and this third-person perspective when we think about relations. Now, at this point, due to the discussion, I probably should say something about the hard problem. Namely, I said, oh, there's one option which you cannot take, and that's a reductionist version. And I didn't say why you shouldn't take that one, or what is the problem. And philosophers have, I don't know, written since 50 years why you shouldn't take that, or why there are kind of principal problems. And one very well-known argument is the so-called conceivability argument. And there's some confusion among a lot of people. The conceivability argument is not about what is actually possible. Maybe some things are possible, maybe some things are not, but that's not the point of the conceivability argument. And the conceivability argument is a bit more subtle, and that's often not clear. So philosophers use this word nomological possibility, which means possible according to known physical laws, basically. But that's not what the conceivability argument is about. The conceivability argument is about metaphysical possibility, which means there's a metaphor to explain what is metaphysical possibility, which is from David Lewis, a famous analytic philosopher. Assume that God created the world. Did he need to do extra work to fix certain facts? If he do not, or she does not need to do this extra work, then something is metaphysically necessitated. If she needs to do this work, then not. And the conceivability argument supposedly shows that certain metaphysical possibilities are left open. So in a nutshell, a reductionist approach entails metaphysical necessity, and the conceivability argument, whether my red can be your blue, or whether there can be zombies or something like that, supposedly show that metaphysical possibility is not the case. So reductionism fails. I won't say whether I believe this or not, or whether you should believe it or not, just to emphasize that for philosophers, conceivability arguments have actually go beyond what we can do in the real world, so to say. Okay. Well, I will go very quickly here, because you didn't ask many related questions here. Just because it was mentioned yesterday, should we trust the structures which we perceive? Should we trust the structures that we are perceptually aware of? No, we should not trust them. There's a proof why we shouldn't do it in a very general sense. An easy example, which was mentioned actually yesterday, there's a certain resource and it comes in quantities. We perceptually represent that. Does our representation need to track this resource quantity? No, it should not. Otherwise, we are kind of doomed, so to say. So imagine there's some ratio, or no, there's some resource of salty stuff. If we take in too much salty stuff, then that's bad for us. If we take in too less salty stuff, it's also bad for us. So the good thing is to be somewhere in the middle. There's a Goldilocks principle. That's just a very easy example, but there are more sophisticated examples which pertain to global structures of our perceptual representations. And then the question is always, what is the probability that those global structures are actually informative about the true nature of reality? And the answer is not much. And instead, our perceptions help us to navigate the world or be useful in an evolutionary sense. For example, you can take certain actions, and some actions are useful and some actions are not useful. And you want to make sure that only those actions are taken which are useful. That would be one, so to say, one purpose of perceptual representation. And that was published in a so-called interface theory of perception, which I worked a little bit, and I contributed a little bit. The thing why it's relevant in the context of phenomenology is this question, well, if that's true, the interface theory of perception, what does that actually tell us about the descriptive study of perceptual structures. Should we actually start thinking about, should we start to kind of try to give a descriptively adequate thing? And if we do that, what does it tell us about this mind-matter relation or the hard problem or whatever? But my answer would be, it doesn't tell us much. And that's why I advocated something which I call deep phenomenology. So you might remember I had this first pass definition of phenomenology as the systematic study of first personal experience. And I said, well, it's actually a bit wrong. You have to finesse it. Deep phenomenology would be the systematic study of deeper principles in consciousness that give rise to conscious experience or to subjective experience. So that's just for clarification why I think this deep phenomenological approach is actually relevant. Now, one important point which I didn't stress, or which I didn't mention actually, is this: a phenomenology-first approach, although many people think it's kind of strange, is actually the most parsimonious and neutral starting point in this whole game. It's much less, it has much less assumptions than, for example, a physicalist starting point or materialist starting point. Where it's like, okay, there is this outside material world which exists and which exists irrespective of me, blah, 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 blah. Well, maybe, but it's an assumption which we actually made. A lot of people don't think about this, that it's actually an assumption. And one of the good things about phenomenology, about Qstr and other people have said as well, of course, is that they make those assumptions explicit. And then they say, okay, we bracket them and we see what else we can do. Okay. The second thing is, obviously, if you say this question, well, okay, bracket is assumption, blah, 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 blah. Well, what is the nature of those deeper conscious processes which I talked about in the phenomenology? And there are different stances which you could take, something which I am very sympathetic to, is what I call a non-dual approach to Husserl, the Advaita Husserliana. The question here is whether there's a distinction between consciousness and what people call subjective experience. Most people who actually use these terms, who are not afraid to use those terms, take it as synonymous. Consciousness is the same as subjective experience, but one could also have this idea, well, consciousness is a bit more fundamental than subjective experience, in a sense, subjective experience as pertaining to one individual. Okay. The third point, which was maybe a bit confusing, especially if you're not a philosopher, is this of supervenience. There is a very big discussion when someone uses the word supervenience. Is it just, in the very weak sense which I use, about different ways of relating descriptions, or does it have any metaphysical impact at relating different ontological domains? And it's mirrored, and there's a similar discussion with respect to the topic of emergence, the different forms of emergence, strong emergence, weak emergence, mind-mind emergence versus mind-matter emergence, and those are very different discussions. So one shouldn't conflate it, and that's why I just restricted it to the very, very simple, or to what I think is the most simplest interpretation. Okay. Now I start with your questions. More or less. Now I already talked about the hard problem. I have to make sure that I go through everything, okay, so here's this phenomenological category, and there were some questions: what is it? What does it? What is it? Is it useful? Is it well defined? Whatever. Okay. So first question first. In the very first presentation we had, there was this question. And it's a very, very good question. Whether those labeled things 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on are actually corresponding to what now yesterday called broad Qualia. And I would say yes, that's a very good interpretation. What do I mean with this set when I say the set of possible experiences? Now I have to remember what was actually the question here. Okay, it was about, for example, intra-individual, are it just experiences of individual, are the experiences of all individuals? My answer would be maybe, maybe not. We had this yesterday we had this distinction between intra-experiential structuralism, inter-experiential structuralism, which is to be, and intra individual structuralism. Sorry, no, that's right. So 2b is actually the, I would say, the thing which corresponds to that. 2a, sorry, 2a. Structuralism, relations within one individual. But that said, there might be a very elegant, depending on what you think, elegant way how to relate intersubjective relations, for example, to this. Okay. The second question was about the nature of the morphisms. What do I mean with that? And there, I kind of repeat. I said, okay, and the categories, I put it open. This allows very different interpretations of morphisms. So some things which were mentioned by you, similarity relations, could be, but they do not exhaust it. Reachable through action, when I remember correctly, that's also a very nice interpretation. It really relates very much to Husserl's ideas. So I mentioned Husserl's method of variation in imagination. That's a sense of reachability within imagination. And some of you mentioned, well, in imagination you can do almost everything. In the real world, not. The question is, of course, what is the real world? Anyway, I think that's an interesting question. Of course, it's a non-trivial thing to actually show or demonstrate or prove that composition laws are actually satisfied. I think every kind of mathematician, applied mathematician, whatever, has to do that. I mean, that's yeah. I just wouldn't want to talk 20 minutes about that. I think it's a waste of time. But anyway, yes, that's true. But the important point is that the category is open in a sense that it allows for different kinds of experiential relations to put in. And that relates very much to the last discussion contribution, which was about the Gödelian stuff, about the observability stuff. And I said, okay, well, what is the perspective? There were some ideas about perspectives, the ineliminability of observability or subjectivity. I will come later to that again. Some other things like boundedness, mechanics, and this whole idea that, well, you can have actually very different ways of establishing whether or not you have a relation. In addition, of course, you need to demonstrate that everything is well with composability. I mean, that's clear. But the point was that you shouldn't fix it to one specific. There's no reason why one would want to fix it to one particular kind of relation. There might be some relations which are more useful than others, but there is no a priori reason to say, okay, there is this finite set of formal input which specifies which kind of relations one should think about. I mean, one can categorify an elephant. The question is always whether it's useful. Okay. Okay. There was this question about broad versus narrow Qualia and how it relates to that. Coming to that now, I think. Yes. And here I kind of made probably the presentational mistake. So those of you who are philosophers probably know. I mean, everyone knows Immanuel Kant, and he published a lot of very important books. And the most well-known book is probably the Critique of Pure Reason. But it was not the only book he published. He also published a much smaller book, the Prolegomena, which have a very similar scope, but are much shorter. And Kant first wrote the critique. No one understood it. He was frustrated. And I said, okay, now let's change the exposition and do the Prolegomena way. And I should have done the Prolegomena way, but I did the critique way. Okay. And that relates to what I said in the morning, where then I couldn't revisit actually the transcendentalism. And that in turn relates to this question, how broad and narrow Qualia connect. Okay, so what's the idea behind transcendentalism? And that was one slide which I didn't show in the morning. So I introduced this terminology, non-reflective phenomenal properties, and just properties of consciousness that you know, like Qualia or structure and whatever. And how we typically think about it is that we have non-reflective properties, and then we have maybe a category which illustrates that, and then we can do a lot of complex stuff and look at complexifications, and then get certain higher phenomenal properties like selfhood and worlds and whatever, the notion of reality and time and so on and so on. And that's one way of kind of proceeding. But there is a different one which is closer in spirit to this transcendental approach, which means, okay, we start with the observation, and that was the way how Kant did it in Polygomena. We start with the observation that there is something which is explainable. So, paradigm example in Kant's case was, okay, there's mathematical knowledge. Now ask, how is mathematical knowledge possible? And here one can think of something very similar. There is qualitative structured experience. Well, how is it made possible? And then one should maybe start with this, what I call reflective phenomenal properties, self-worth, time, and how they inform the category, which then helps us to understand these phenomenal properties. And so I have 10 more minutes. Huh? No. Anyway, so I will do that. There was a lot of discussion about the difference between subjectivity and self. And I think that's a very, very important point. And it's another confusion whether or not those notions are conflated, subjective and self. One way of seeing that it might be conflated is to say, well, what is a subjective experience without self? Can there be something like that? If you say, okay, there can be subjective experiences without self experiences, then you make a distinction already. So very provocatively, one can have maybe subjective experiences without selves and selves without subjective experiences. Now we can ask, what is a self? And that's very tricky. So in end of the 90s, Qstr, a well-known philosopher, published a paper where he just counted the notion of different notions of self in the literature. And he said, oh, there are 31 notions of self. And that was 25 years ago. So now I would say probably there are 50 or so. So instead of going through all of them and saying, singling out one particular notion, one could think about maybe getting a bit more systematical idea about this. And one way of kind of making a distinction between different notions of self is what is called an entity theory. So a self is something like a single persistent mental thing, a single object. Often people associate that with a particular content in experience. Then there is a continuity theory of self, where self is just a continuity of some psychological or computational or whatever processes. In philosophy, very influential is a so-called bundle theory of self. David Hume proposed something like that. He said, oh, well, the self is just kind of a bundle of experiences, and other ways of doing that. But entity continuity and bundle theory of self are more on a very systematic. I will give you a good distinction. All those 31 or most of those 31 notions of self can then be categorified according to this scheme. So it's really complicated. Okay, so far so much to this question, what is the self? Now, the question, what is subjectivity? And also there you can have different approaches. There's something which I call a quasi-epistemological notion or epistemological. Actually, I put a quasi because I was told I shouldn't talk about knowledge. So that's why I said quasi. It's the way how certain pieces, I use like hand-wavy terminology, how certain pieces of information are given to us. If they're given in a perspectival way, according to these principles we learned in the discussion contribution, for example, that would constitute maybe a quasi-epistemological theory. But there's also a stronger notion, an ontological notion. It tells us something about the nature of the things involved, of the processes involved here. You might have an ontological notion about subjectivity, but you might also just say, okay, well, maybe not. I just, so to say, retreat to this epistemological notion. Now the question, that's a question to you, an open question, is whether you really, it seems to be kind of clear-cut, but the question is whether you do it. Can always neatly think between an epistemological and ontological notion of self. And a lot of transcendental idealism, for example, can be spelled out in a way that you cannot always, or that you cannot distinguish between these notions. So you have this innocent looking epistemological things, but then it drives you to weird ontological properties. And that's what's happening. But the larger message is it's maybe a good thing, at least that would be my interpretation of what Husserl did, and to distinguish between self and subjectivity. That relates to this notion of ineliminability of perspectivity. I don't know. So you could, I mean, probably subjectivity, at least if you're a phenomenologist, a Husserlian phenomenologist, he would say, okay, subjectivity is kind of ineliminable. You shouldn't get rid of it, but that doesn't mean that you buy into all these kind of notions of self. Okay. Now, that's an interesting point. Some of you mentioned, okay, a categorical treatment or a mathematical treatment more general, or a scientific treatment more general should be comprehensive. And well, one important point to stress is there are contents of consciousness, and we talk a lot about contents of consciousness, about Qualia or whatever, but contents are not everything. And that's the typical thing which a phenomenologist would say. There are things to our experience in addition to contents. And it's even worse, if you would not be able to account for these things which are additional to content, there's no good reason to actually call it consciousness in the first place. So there are two extreme positions, so to say. One is taken by analytic phenomenologist and Pavi, who says that what it is likeness is essentially what it is like for meanness. So that expresses the idea that subjectivity is ineliminable. On the other hand, you have Thomas Metzinger, whom I mentioned in my morning talk, who said that no such things as selves exist in the world. Nobody ever was or had a self. Truth is probably somewhat in the middle, I guess. There's actually not even a kind of contradiction. And that's what people often don't realize. So you can believe in something like a no self view, but still think that there is an ineliminability of subjectivity. And here, that's more, again, an open question to IIT. In that case, there was an article by Calvin McQueen who tried to run or adapt Chalmers-like zombie argument to the case of IIT. And that somehow expresses this worry. There are certain additional structures to contents. And if you don't have those structures, it's not clear why that should be called consciousness at all. And the argument goes, well, you could have something like an integrated information being without conscious experience, or like an IIT zombie. Is that possible or not? I mean, does it make sense? And that pertains to this larger question of whether formalization is a good guide to conceivability. So, meaning that whether a mathematical theory, whether it's a categorical theory or something else, actually helps you to understand whether something is conceivable or not in a philosophical sense. Okay. No. Is it 3 minutes? Okay. Okay. So I talked a little bit about this pre-reflective self, the notion of a pre-reflective self being somehow in the middle of a full-fledged self as entity, as content, and just a mere structuring feature of our experience. And I think there's one point where there's a nice connection to category theory, between phenomenology and category theory. Phenomenologists often emphasize that a very, let's say, important thing about the notion of a self, the notion of a pre-reflective self, is that you can have phenomenological reflection. So you can have higher reflection on your experience, and then you can bring this pre-reflective self to a content. So at one point we get aware that we are, actually, that our self is involved in our experience. For phenomenologists, that's a higher level of reflection. And that kind of mirrors what you can do in category theory. You can go to higher category theory, for example, two-category theory, where you don't have only morphisms and objects, but morphisms between morphisms, and then you can play with that and then go higher and higher. And if you are willing to entertain this possibility that to all of these levels you can associate different notions of self, then the question becomes, oh, what level are we actually? What is our self? Are we, what is our case, so to say? Okay. And that would be in this quasi-phenomenological terminology, a K minus one reflective self. Okay, I'll skip over that. I think I overheard this mention of intersubjectivity. That's very important to phenomenology. It's one of those properties which I actually didn't say anything about. The question is here, or phenomenology is actually believed, is often believed that certain objects, so this idea that I can observe physical objects out there, encodes or implies this notion of intersubjectivity. So we had this thought experiment, we had this idea that the difference between a perception and imagination, the perception is still in some sense, we still have the sense that something is here or not, and that might be due to this entailment of intersubjectivity. So other people can have the perception as well, and it doesn't go away with imagination. And the question is, how far do we go? I mean, how extreme is it? Would we say, like, I don't know, maybe some people would say that space or our experience of space is just an intersubjective thing. Maybe not. Or more generally related to this question of universality. If that's the case, then it's conceivable that other beings which are conscious have very different kinds of structuring experiences, like different experience space or experience the world in a very different way. So that again connects to this issue of openness, which I stressed. One shouldn't limit oneself in his or her formalization such that one specific thing comes out of it. Okay, and with that I'm finished. I thank you again for your question and for your attention late night, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I just want to bring up the relevance of altered states of consciousness, of course. You know, you were talking about the pre-reflective self as a built-in feature of experience, and earlier we heard about subjectivity being ineliminable. But throughout history, there are many accounts of experiences. I mean, experiences is maybe not even the right word to use, but there is no pre-reflective self. There is no subjectivity. I had people describing that to me in my lab as well. So maybe that could be part of this kind of phenomenology-first approach, is really looking at the fringe cases to see what these invariant features are. But then a question I have is, with this category and with each kind of object in the category being a broad qualia experience, I wonder if altered states is actually an interesting place to start for the mathematization of experiences using category theory, because within certain meditation states and within certain drug-induced states, they're kind of regarded as deconstructive. So the degrees of freedom are actually reduced. And so the number of possible states that a phenomenological system can visit are actually reduced. So I wonder if that would make that more amenable to this mathematization, possibly.
Yeah, I think yes, it's a very interesting case too. I mean, I must say to the case study. So I know about many reports of no self experiences. Perfectly fine. Whether it's no pre-reflective self-experience, I'm less certain actually. So it's always a question: is it how much should you trust it? I mean, but that's an individual question. One can argue this way or not. But in principle, I think this whole field of altered state of experiences, understanding them as a relational thing. How many connections could you have, and maybe you have less connection in certain states, and you modulate that or whatever, correlate that to something. That's a very interesting area. Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about this intersubjectivity and subjectivity itself. Like if, for instance, kind of like also hinging on the idea of like social consciousness. Like if we didn't have these interactions, where we could like compare these interpersonal experiences, do you think that this notion would not be there of subjectivity?
If we could better compare, well,
Like it kind of arises
yes.
in relation to other interpersonal experiences.
Do we talk about intersubjectivity? I hope so, because you probably know more about it than me. But anyway, I think, well, very end the answer here would be to say, I think that if you take this categorical view, if you think, okay, you have this network, or you have these relations between experiences, and sometimes you have networks which you cannot come out, so to say, and that gives you a good notion of a boundary. And if you then, that kind of enables one to think about intersubjectivity in a very commonsensical way.